This is a Mac Mini, and this, another Mac Mini. A computer that can fit in the palm of my hand, but a computer that is playing the latest and greatest AAA video game from Ubisoft, Assassin's Creed Shadows, and playing it quite well. A Mac Mini! So I don't know if you've heard the news, but the gaming industry is in a fairly massive slump at the moment. For the first time in over a decade, revenues are down to a sub 1% growth rate. That's not good. Now, fingers are pointing to stagnating subscription signups, increased development costs and timelines for AAA games, reduced ad efficacy for free-to-play mobile content, and a whole host of other issues. But one thing is clear. PC gaming is actually a bright spot in this otherwise troubled industry, because whereas console growth has stagnated since 2021, PC gaming revenue has grown 20% in that same time. And much of that excitement, at least outside of China, can be attributed to handheld gaming and increasing Linux market share with Valve's SteamOS, which is soon to be making its way to third-party handhelds. But Apple sees this growing market too, and I think that they are uniquely positioned to make huge inroads and earn big money in this pivotal but once-in-a-generation market shift. If only they can play their cards right. Thing is, I'm not sure they're capable of that. The lion's share of Valve's success on Linux, beyond its near monopoly of the PC games marketplace, can be attributed to their work with Proton, a compatibility layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux. And Apple, as you likely know, is taking a similar approach, albeit at a smaller scale, with their game porting toolkit. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical similarities and differences that exist between Valve's Proton and Apple's GPT-K because, well, we've already done that in a previous video, and you should definitely go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. But I do want to highlight a major practical difference. Proton is designed to let end users, you and me, run our Windows games on our Linux machines, independent of whatever the game developer thinks of that, whereas Apple's GPT-K puts the onus on developers to intentionally, natively port their games to the Mac. We're not really involved. Despite that difference, Apple's strategy is working. Kinda. In the last 30 days alone, we have seen the release of 6 fairly major games, 4 of them AAA, and 3 of them released on day one, the same as every other platform. One of those? Assassin's Creed Shadows. Available through the Mac App Store and weighing in at 115 gigabytes, only Apple Silicon Macs are supported. However, Ubisoft has detailed plans to also bring the game to M-series iPads. And honestly, that's pretty cool, given that this is a current console-gen game. So how does it play? Honestly, just fine. On this M4 Pro Mac Mini, we're able to maintain around 30 frames per second at a 1440p display res while using Metal FX dynamic resolution and the medium graphics preset. Though it is highly area dependent, as best we can tell, the average rendered resolution is just below 1080p. Having said that, because of how impressive modern upscaling functions, it does look better than the numbers might suggest. Unfortunately, with 1% lows hitting just 18 frames per second, the game feels too jittery all too often. Now, our M3 MacBook Pro fared significantly better, averaging in the mid-40s at those same settings with 1% lows around 30 frames per second. That's perfectly playable. But then again, that's hardly an affordable computer, and dollar per dollar is still not a very good performer. So on the other end of the spectrum, run the game on a base model $999 M4 MacBook Air, and, well, you're presented with a warning dialog to suggest that you do not meet the minimum hardware requirements. Except for, according to Ubisoft, you do. Now, in your hideout, where ray tracing is turned on and incapable of being disabled, performance is like unplayably abysmal. We're talking the low teens of frame rates at 1080p. Once you leave the hideout to access the open world sans ray tracing, you'll get into the low 20s, but that's still unacceptable. To get a playable frame rate, you've got to dial that MacBook Air down to 900p low with a 35% render target, which means basically upscaled 480p. Is this an M4 or a Nintendo Switch? Now, some may be quick to say, hold on, that's a low TDP fanless laptop. And that's true. The base M4 Mac Mini, sporting a fan, is able to maintain a frame rate in the high 20s up to about 30 frames per second at 1080p medium from a 540 to 720p variable render target. A fan? It makes a big difference. And, it's not so bad for a $600 Mac, eh? Except, no, it kind of is, because it gets obliterated by the Steam Deck's older, less capable, even more efficient 15-watt APU. But maybe we can ascribe this to Ubisoft being, well, Ubisoft, because early Steam reviews suggest that the game slogs even on great PC hardware. Other AAA launches include day one support for Civilization VII, a game installed through Steam. And hey, one reason it was so easy to install was because we used today's sponsor Ugreen and their NASSync DXP 4800 Plus that runs LAN cache via Docker. So instead of downloading the entire game from Steam servers over our slow point-to-point internet connection on every computer that we tested, we only had to download it once and then cache it locally, saving us bandwidth and time. If you don't know, a NAS is, in effect, a personal cloud that you own, making it secure, cost-effective storage. And with supported capacity of up to 112 terabytes, you can store a lifetime of data, 39 million pictures, 76,000 movies. And thanks to its powerful 12th gen pentacore Intel processor, you get great performance for Plex transcoding and other network utilities that you may want to run. You also get 2.5 and 10 gigabit Ethernet, which is not common in NAS's this price range, which makes for ripping fast file transfers of over 1,200 megabytes per second. Setup: super easy. You pop in your hard drives without any tools required, and once it gets going, well, you can even set it to automatically back up your photos, your files, and your OneDrive data across all of your devices. It works on your smartphone, your laptops, and even TVs. Its photo library management in particular is pretty impressive, and the AI Smart Album can even identify people, places, and things. But best of all, it's all done locally, so your personal data stays private and never gets uploaded to online servers. Right now, there is a limited 20% discount for World Backup Day, so check the link in the video description below to learn more. With Civilization VII installed, we'll see a title that runs, frankly, excellently, not just on this Mac, but on every Mac that we tested. Graphically, it performed suitably well, but it really excelled in AI performance, where Macs find themselves amongst the best PC CPU and GPU combos. And unlike the Switch version, there are no map restrictions. However, I admit this should be more of an expectation than a pleasant surprise. Another new game that excels on macOS is 2 Point Museum. On an M4 Pro, I can run this at 5K max settings and maintain about 30 FPS, but if I settle for 4K medium settings, I can push to well over 60. Given how densely populated this game's assets can get from a memory perspective, it is a more demanding game than meets the eye. And a number of other indie and less graphically intensive games that have made their way to the Mac recently, like Palworld, Dredge, Sniper Elite 4, and the recently updated No Man's Sky, all run great. But at the end of the day, your catalog is still limited relative to what you get on Windows, and beholden to the whims of developers. And frankly, history would dictate that we'll see more games like Dredge on the Mac as opposed to big budget titles like Assassin's Creed. Personally, I prefer Dredge, but you know what I mean. Which is where the wonderful world of real-time translation comes into play, taking a page right out of Valve's playbook. Crossover is a third-party application that utilizes Wine, the game porting toolkit, and a number of other graphics APIs like the open-source DXMT to run Windows apps and games on macOS. Other similar apps like Whiskey exist for free. However, the Crossover team is rumored to work fairly closely with Apple on fixing a lot of the underlying issues they come across with certain titles, and they typically yield the best performance on the greatest number of games. In any instance, unlike Valve's Proton for Linux, which shares an x86 platform with Windows, these Apple Silicon Macs have to use Rosetta for architecture translation too, in addition to utilizing an intermediate graphics API and OS compatibility layer. So you may suspect, as I did, that this would mean abysmal performance. But also like me, you may be surprised. Red Dead Redemption 2, one of my favorite video games of all time, runs on this M4 Pro Mac Mini at 1440p with all of the settings maxed out and pulling frame rates in the mid-30s with AMD FSR enabled. Now, this game doesn't support frame generation, but frankly, it doesn't need it. It looks fantastic, and even though it doesn't run quite as well on something like the MacBook Air, even the MacBook Air can play this game at acceptable resolutions and frame rates, which is nothing short of remarkable. No, this is not a PCMR 4K everything experience, but it's a thin and light laptop, barely larger than an iPad, that can play this game for over 10 hours on a single charge without as much as a solitary whisper of a fan. That's marvelous. That's cool. Not literally, it gets pretty warm, but that's cool. That's different. And if Red Dead Redemption is too old of a game for you, well, the 2-year-old The Last of Us Part 1 remake, which was widely criticized on launch as not well optimized for PC, also runs surprisingly great. Yet again, I can play the game at 1440p high settings on my M4 Pro Mac Mini and pull around 40 FPS. For a computer that can fit in the palm of my hand, this is pretty extraordinary. And performance here does best the Steam Deck by no small margin, which leads me to believe that the Assassin's Creed Shadows Mac board may not have been a great one. Behold, my utter surprise. Though not best in class, Macs can game. The problem is not the hardware, nor even the software. With Game Mode, which prioritizes system resources and Bluetooth controller latency, per-game controller profiles that allow you to remap every gamepad key, modify haptic feedback and vibration, capture gameplay, and even use the DualSense touchpad for cursor support. I mean, that's better than Windows. The problem is not the platform, it's the experience, and the blame is to be placed solely on Apple. The first problem is inconsistency in storefront access and library management. Assassin's Creed Shadows and Resident Evil 2 are only available on the Mac App Store. No Man's Sky and Two Point Museum are only available on Steam. Dredge and Balatro, well, they're available on both Steam and the Mac App Store, but Balatro is only available on the Mac if you subscribe to Apple Arcade. There is a one-time binary purchase for Balatro on iPad and iPhone, but that doesn't translate to the Mac, unlike Dredge, which does. Now, when you do have to interface with the Mac App Store, it is hell. For one, games almost never go on sale like they do on other platforms, probably because the developers have forgotten there's even a Mac version to begin with, and Apple is completely ill-equipped to distribute software that doesn't work on all of their machines, which has historically been the case. So right now, the only requirements that a developer can set for a software title like a game is operating system version and whether or not the machine is Apple Silicon. Intel, Apple Silicon, or both. That's it. So the Mac App Store says that Assassin's Creed Shadows is compatible with my M1 iMac, but it isn't. Now, Ubisoft has a very nice compatibility chart on their website, as we discussed previously, but they can't include that inside of the image carousel on the purchase page because that violates App Store guidelines. So, and I can't believe I actually have to say this, but I feel bad for Ubisoft. The best they can do is place the minimum specs in raw text in some weirdly formatted block with a bunch of spaces inside of the app's description in hopes that people will see it. Where I won't empathize with Ubisoft is how incredibly vague the minimum specs are. An M1 Max is what the App Store says. Okay, so that rules out the M1 and the M1 Pro, but what about the M3? The M1 Max has a much more powerful GPU than the M3, and yet the M3 supported. It runs, albeit at lower performance. So well, then maybe the M2 as well. No, that doesn't run. Ubisoft links to their handy compatibility sheet in the app's description, but the link is not clickable nor text selectable. And don't blame Ubisoft for doing a weird thing here, because if you're an app developer, you know that App Store Review requires you to link to a terms and conditions page in raw text that is not clickable nor selectable on a single Apple platform and never has been. Great work, gang! Steam, by contrast, is the clear market leader for a reason. Their store accommodates all types of software, with great discoverability for new content by categorical sorting, sales, and similar titles to those in your library. There's an excellent built-in review system, community section, and more, which makes it first-rate for both end users and game publishers. And the no questions asked 2-hour gameplay refund policy is invaluable, giving gamers a zero-risk way to try a software title that they're unsure of. Apple can't fail to offer these features, giving both developers and end users a mediocre experience and wonder, gee, why isn't gaming happening on the Mac? As I see it, they have two options. The first is to try and make peace with Valve after years of neglect, hoping that they'll finally update Steam to run natively on Apple Silicon. From there, Apple could either implement a fork of Proton by bringing Vulkan support to macOS, or take the more difficult approach of open sourcing the game porting toolkit and D3D Metal. But either way, they'd need to invest a lot more money and time and effort into what Crossover is effectively already doing, making user-initiated cross-compatibility work on their platform seamlessly. Instead of waiting around for developers to port their games to a platform with such small market share, Apple could just take control and build something that just works, handling storefront and library management over to the pros, the folks at Valve. While idealistic, this won't happen because Apple, and I know this is going to sound kind of nuts, really likes money and control. So that brings us to our second option, which is really the only real option. Strap a set on and walk the mother-frickin' walk. Build a dedicated gaming storefront, one that isn't a catch-all app store, but a curated game-focused marketplace with better discoverability, sales tools, and community features. Because I know they like services revenue, implement a loss leader strategy, at least initially, like Microsoft did with Game Pass, offering flagship titles bundled into an Apple Arcade subscription at a break-even or even free with hardware purchase price as a way to draw users into a broader ecosystem. Emulate and refine that value-driven approach that Microsoft has flirted with, but ultimately has been unable to perfect. And last, throw all of the money at developers, game studios, and publishers. Subsidies, development grants, or guaranteed revenue streams would encourage studios to prioritize macOS versions, or at least not be worried they're going to take a bath on one, which some developers have. Long story short, and a surprise to no one, money talks. Now, is this a catch-all solution that would dethrone Valve, console makers, and coronate Apple as king? No, but it would bring them into the conversation. Mac hardware and software is admittedly more similar to a home console than it is to a PC, but if done correctly has the capacity to bring in both pro gamers and noobs with hardware that surpasses conventional expectation. And if there's anything that handheld game consoles have taught us over the last couple of years, it's that experience trumps performance, and Apple is uniquely positioned to vertically capitalize on that. We have seen an improvement in the last 2 years, but moving from 10 old games per year to 20 old games per year plus a handful of new ones is not going to cut it. If Apple ever wants this to happen, they've got to act now, and swiftly at that. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay snazzy.